Now, welcome to our today's science lesson, that is standard 8 science, still discussing animals. Now, on our last discussion or our last lesson, we talked about feeding of livestock, or the method of feeding of livestock. Now, we gave out the types of feeds that are given to different animals, and also gave out the importance of those feeds to those animals. Now, today we are now going to discuss on how now these animals are domesticated, or how now these animals are taken to obtain those feeds. Now, the process by which, or the act by which now this domesticated animal obtain the feeds is what we call grazing. The act, it is an act of domesticated animal obtaining the food or feed. So the act of this domesticated animal obtaining feed is what we call grazing. Now today we are going to discuss generally on the methods of this grazing. Now, how do these animals obtain their feeds? We have three main classification of this method of grazing. Number one, we classify the method of grazing as either rotational grazing, or we can classify them as zero grazing, or lastly we can classify them as herding. Now we have number one, rotational grazing, we have zero grazing, and herding. Those are the three main classification of method under method of grazing. Now, under rotational grazing, we have the sub branches of this rotational grazing, or we have three examples of rotational grazing. The first example under rotational grazing is what we call the strip grazing. The second example is paddocking, and lastly we have what we call the tethering. Now we are going to carry out, or we are going to discuss the classification or the characteristics of these methods of grazing. Number one, we are going to start by discussing the general characteristics of all rotational method of grazing. Now, under the rotational method of grazing, number one, we have to understand that these animals are grazed directly on the field, hence they feed on the pasture. We discussed under feeds, and we said we have what we call pasture, and we said pasture, these are feeds that are taken or eaten by the animals directly from the field. Now, if the method involves movement of animals from one place to another, this one falls under what we call rotational grazing. The characteristics, number one, we say the pasture is divided into several units or portions. We have a land, this is a piece of land. Now this general piece of land is subdivided into some portions or into some units. Now we may have the first unit, second unit, third unit, and the fourth unit. Now these units, when you see the subdivisions, we say this is a rotational grazing. The second characteristics of rotational grazing, we have the animals feed on plants on the parts of the pasture for a period of time. When you say the animal feeding on a part of the land or a part of the pasture at a certain time, for example, when this is the first portion, this animal will feed here for either 1 week or 2 weeks. Thereafter, after 1 week, it moves to the second portion of that pasture. So that movement, the animal feeding in one portion at a certain period of time, then it is taken to another portion. The third characteristics, this classification, that is the rotational grazing, it has they are then moved to the next part. I've already talked about it. Then lastly, you say this rotational grazing allows the regrowth or the regrowing of pastures. Now, if the animal have grazed in this first portion, then we move that animal to the second portion. What will happen to the first portion is the grass that has been already grazed by the animal will now start regrowing. At the end, if this animal reaches the last portion, which is the fourth portion, you will get that at the first portion, the pasture is already ready to be fed to those animals. Now, these are the general characteristics of rotational grazing. Now we are going to discuss the example now, the exact example of this rotational grazing. Number one, we are going to talk about the strip grazing. Strip grazing, from the term strip, we say the portion of pasture is divided into strips. Now these strips are divided by use of what we call a temporary or a movable electric fence. This movable electric fence, it enables these animals to eat or to feed on one part of this land. Then we move that part or the fence into another area where now the animal also feed on that new land. Now we say the pasture land is divided into strips. Number two, the strips are separated by what you call the temporarily movable electric fence. It is electric fence, it means it has a little bit of electricity just to keep the animal, to give the animal a very small shock. This shock controls the animal movement so that they will not go to another area where we don't want them to graze at that time. Number three, we say the animal are grazed in a restricted area. So if we have restricted this animal to feed at this area here, we have to ensure that the animal feed to this grass that is to this pasture that is here until it ends. If it finishes this grass here, now we can move the electric fence to another area or to another piece so that now the animal start feeding on the second part of that land. When the animal finish that, we move that electric fence to another part so that now we say the animal feed on the restricted portion of land. Now this also, the area is then given part of the time so that now we allow the growth of the grass that the animal fed during the first part. Now this part here is what we call the temporary fence. This is the temporary fence or the movable electrical fence. This part here is what we call the pasture land or the pasture grass. So the animal feed directly on the grasses that is here. Then this is the general land of that area. So this is what we call the strip grazing. Number two, we are going to discuss the paddocking. Paddocking is an example of rotational grazing. So under paddocking, it is different from strip grazing. And what makes it different is that now here we use a permanent fence. With paddocking, we use a permanent fence. This means when we have a piece of land, this piece of land, we have to build a permanent fence here. This permanent fence controls or restricts these animals so that they can feed only in this area that you have been given to that animal. After a given period of time, you will get that every portion of or every unit has a gate. If this gate, it allows now the movement of this animal from this area to the next portion of land that is already to the next piece of unit of the pasture. Now after animal finishing eating the next, we have also another gate so that now it allows the continuous movement of that animal from one unit to another unit. Now we say number one, it is divided by use of what we call a permanent. It has a permanent fence. Then we said it is divided into what we call the paddocks. The small portions that are divided by the permanent. This one, only the first one here, it's a paddock. Paddock number one, we have paddock number two, paddock number three, and paddock number four. So those are what we call paddocks. Now, I have already said in each paddock we have a gate. This gate I have already illustrated that it allows the movement of animal from one area to another area. Then in every paddock we say that the animal graze in one paddock, it finishes the grass, then we take it to another area. That is, they graze on one paddock, then it also moves to the next by through the use of that gate. Now the other characteristics of this paddocking is that now in every paddock we have what we call the watering point. This watering point is where now the animal gets water. After the animal has grazed and it wants to take water, and then it will have to move to what we call a watering point. Now this watering point, for example, if I have my paddocks here, at this point here you get that now we have what we call a watering point. And this part here we have what we call the gate, and here it's what we call the permanent fence. So you have to understand the difference between paddocking and strip grazing. Now the other characteristics of paddocking, we say the animal are moved from it moves from one paddock to another paddock so that we allow the growth of the grass in the first paddock until the animal reaches the fourth paddock. Then we take it back to the initial area. Now, the reason why we move animal from one area to another is just to allow the regrowth of the grass. Now, that is the second type of rotational grazing. Now we are going to discuss also the other type of rotational grazing, where now we talk about tethering. Tethering is very common in areas where the farmers have very few animals. Now with the tethering, we say now the animal is tied on a peg. When this animal is tied on a peg, we use either a rope or we can use a string. When you use a string, the animal is restricted only to graze on an area where we call it a circular area. Now this circular area, just maybe an example here, if this is now the peg, now we tied here our animal, we have that rope that is controlling the animal movement. This animal will graze around that peg like that. Now when you move, we have an example of in mathematics where you have this one as being the radius of the animal. The rope becomes the radius of the animal grazing, and this is now the piece of pasture that this animal is only allowed to graze. Now the characteristics of tethering, generally, number one, we say if the animal is tied on a peg or a post. Then number two, it is by use of a rope. Number two, we say the animal is allowed to graze on a restricted region, that is this way, or that's to the end of the grass, then that is the end. Then also we say the animal graze on a circular region. I've already illustrated the circular region. Then we say the water, that is water, is supplied to this animal by either the person who is in charge of that animal. Now this part here, you may get that now we have a basin which has water, the basin that contains water, and also we can supply what we call the salt links. We have also to supply the salt links. This salt links helps this animal so that it can also improve the appetite of the animal. So we say the water and salt links are placed to where the animal is. Then also lastly, we say it is suitable for farmers with few numbers of livestock or a few number of animals. Now we have the disadvantage of using this method. The disadvantage of tethering is, number one, if this animal is taken to an area where we have a lot of obstacles, we may get that this animal will get entangled. When the animal gets entangled, it will tie itself on the objects. When it ties itself on the objects, it means at the end of the day you may get that the animal is choked off, some parts are destroyed, that some parts are worn out by the objects. And also, if anybody will not come to rescue the animal may die because of now the restriction and also the entangling and choking of the objects around that area. So that is the disadvantage of using tethering. And another disadvantage of using tethering is that now if this animal is not tied well, you may get it may now break the rope and get into the crop, so that now it can destroy the crops that are on that region. Now we move to another method of grazing. Remember, this is just under rotational grazing. Examples, we say we have strip grazing, paddocking, and tethering. Now here we are going to discuss now what we call the zero grazing or stall feeding. With zero grazing, it is carried out in areas where we have very many people, or in areas that has dense populated. Now we are going to discuss zero grazing, and under zero grazing we are going to discuss on how now zero grazing has the different characteristics of zero grazing, and the other name for zero grazing is what we call stall feeding. Now the first characteristics is that now this area we have what we call a shed or a permanent house. This permanent house is only meant for either the keeping of this animal, feeding of the animal, and provision of feeds to that animal. Now the first characteristics, we say the animal are enclosed in a permanent shed or a permanent structure or a shed or a permanent what we call a pen, a calf pen. Now number one, the fodder and pastures are provided to the animal. You go to the field, you harvest the grass, then come at home and give it to the animal. That is also carried out in zero grazing. With zero grazing, everything is provided to that animal. The animal is not allowed to move from one area to another. That's why it's not called zero grazing, but it's called zero grazing. The other characteristics with the zero grazing, we say water, we have what we call water troughs, and we have what we call the feeding troughs. Now what is the importance of having water troughs? And what is the importance of having feeding troughs? Now when you talk of water troughs are mainly used for provision of water to these animals that are living in that a hard or a permanent structure. When you talk of a feeding trough, this feeding trough is where now we place our feeds so that the animal can get its food from there. Then we have another characteristic. We say this structure, what we call a calf pen or a shed, has some parts. The first part, it has what we call a calf pen. The calf pen is a part where now the young one of this cattle lives or stays. When you talk of a resting place, when the animal has finished feeding to the grass that we have provided or the fodder that we have provided, now the animal also can have to rest. So we have what we call a resting place. The other part is what we call a milking place. This is where now the milking process takes place. Then we have what we call a store and also what we call a milking area. I've already talked about it. Now we have what we call a store. With the store, we either store the things that are used for milking, or we store there the food that can be used for a provision of that animal. Now the store, it can be used for either storing of food. It can also be used to store instruments that are used either for milking, and also that can be used either for treatment and other things. Now, the other characteristics of zero grazing, we say it is suitable for areas that has a very either very small piece of land, and also in areas that is highly dense. It is most dense. The areas that has more people, that's the one we can apply this type of zero grazing. So if we have many people around us, we can build somewhere a house, then we can also carry out our livestock keeping. Hence, this one is a very best method in a densely populated area. Also, it is suitable in expensive. It is expensive to start. Why do you say it is expensive to start? You need to buy what we call cement. You need to buy either bricks. You need to buy everything so that you can carry out what we call construction. And this structure, it has some needs so that we have a clear drainage. If we don't have a clear drainage, it means the wastes from this animal will have just to stuck there, and hence it will lead to bad environment for that animal. The animal needs a clean environment. So we have to ensure that the drainage of the house is well, and also it is expensive because now the investment that you have to put in that permanent structure is what leads it to be expensive. Now also, it is expensive because now how can you maintain it? You have to keep on renewing things once and for all. Because if you, for example, the feeding trough, if the feeding trough get broke, it means you have to get also to buy another one. If the watering trough breaks, you have to buy another one. So that's why we say it is expensive in the matter of either maintenance and also in the matter of either to start it. Then it requires a lot of labor. In that. Now, one, you have to require a person either to milk that animal. You have to get a person either to keep clean the room of that animal. You have to get a person to get the pasture to that animal, so that either you have to get also the feeds to that animal, hence leading it to be more expensive, so that it requires a lot of labor. So labor is just the need of the energy that is required towards the maintenance and also towards the requirement of that animal. Now, the last part we are going to discuss the method of grazing. The last method of grazing is what we call herding. Now, herding is also called ranching. We call it ranching. That is modern name. The modern name of herding is what we call ranching. Very fast, we are going to discuss the characteristics very fast. Number one, the animal are grazed on large piece of land. We have the animal, we take it to another land, so that now we give them a chance just to feed on the grasses freely. Number two, we say the animal move freely without restrictions. There is no restriction. The animal can feed anywhere it needs. Then number three, the person or the people have to look to that animal so that now they cannot get to eat either crops, and also so that they cannot destroy the buildings in that region. Now, the person who looks after this animal is what we call either a herdsman or a herdswoman. It depends. If it's a man, it's a herdman. Then if it's a woman, it's a herdwoman. So this is a person who looks after this animal under this herding. Number three, the animal walk to watering regions or watering points. The animal has to move to where the water point is. Even if it is a river, the animal has to go to the river so that they can get water. Next, we say the animal can stray and also destroy the people's crop. This is very common. Most of the people who look after this animal may either they may either be very not careful. If they are not careful, it means the animal can get to the other lands and then destroy the crops of that area. Next, we say that it's suitable for farmers with large piece of land, and also it is suitable for farmers that has a lot of animal stock. Now, the last part, that's the last point, that's a point to note, is that now when we discussed commercial feeds have some disadvantage. The first disadvantage is that it lacks it lacks water, and also it lacks roughages. This is because it is in powder form. When it is powder form, it lacks water. That means it's not succulent, and also it lacks roughage because it is in a powder form. Now, generally today, you have to understand the methods of grazing. You have to understand the types of rotational grazing. You have to understand the characteristics of every type of grazing. If you understand that, it will not be difficult for you when it comes to handling your exams. Otherwise, thank you very much. Let's meet during our next lesson, inshallah.